In the 15th century, kings and queens were not only concerned with ruling, but also with ensuring that their children and heirs would take the throne after them. Now imagine that you are Isabella, a young princess with a seemingly uncertain destiny, as the throne of Castile was up for grabs. Everything seemed difficult, but what Isabella didn't know was that her courage and determination would make her one of the most powerful and influential monarchs in Spanish history. But before continuing this story, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, leave your like and comment on what you think of the content. This is very important to us. Isabella was born in 1451, at a time when the Kingdom of Castile was mired in political uncertainty. Her brother, Henry I, was king, but his reign was marked by problems of legitimacy and popular support. Many believed that he was incapable of governing effectively, and as if that were not enough, her brother also had no legitimate children who could inherit the throne. The empire was on the verge of crisis, and the future seemed cloudy. However, a crucial factor that would help Elizabeth assume the throne was the support of several powerful factions within the kingdom. When Henry I died in 1474, the situation became even more confusing. Two women were vying for the succession: Elizabeth, the late king's sister, and Joan, Henry I's daughter, who was known as Joan the Beltrai. The issue of succession generated a brutal conflict that involved nobles and clergy and divided the country. Isabel, still young and newly crowned, faced an enormous challenge. Even though she was supported by a significant portion of the nobility, she had to fight against those who supported Joanna, who believed that she was the rightful heir. It was not just a power struggle, it was a battle for the honor and the future of Castile. It was then that Elizabeth demonstrated her true strength. She knew how to surround herself with strategic allies, and despite the difficulties, managed to gain the trust of the people and the armed forces. She was not just any princess, she was a determined woman with a great sense of justice and a remarkable ability to make difficult decisions. Throughout her rise, Elizabeth showed that she was not afraid of challenges and knew how to face them. After establishing herself as Queen of Castile, Isabella knew that the next step would be to ensure the stability of her reign. But like any ruler of the time, she knew that politics was not just about internal decisions. It also involved strategic alliances. And for Isabella, the alliance that mattered most was about to happen. In 1469, at the age of 18, Isabella married Ferdinand of Aragon, a strong, intelligent, and above all, ambitious prince. But this was no ordinary marriage. It was not just a union of hearts and love, but a carefully engineered political union. In those days, royal marriages were instruments of power. By marrying Ferdinand, Isabella not only united Castile and Aragon, but also two powerful kingdoms, laying the foundation for the future of what would become a unified Spain. The marriage, despite its historical importance, was not immediately approved. Isabella, who was already Queen of Castile, had to face opposition from many nobles and even from her own brother, Henry I, who did not look favorably on the union. He believed that Ferdinand should not have the power that he would gain from the alliance. But Isabella, firm and determined, defied expectations and married Ferdinand in secret, creating a union that would not only change the future of Castile, but would also have repercussions for the entire world. Ferdinand of Aragon, on the other hand, was not just any prince. He was intelligent, strategic, and most importantly, a man with Isabella's same vision for the future. Together, they formed an unbeatable duo. They began to govern jointly, respecting the autonomy of their respective kingdoms, but always with the idea of consolidating a stronger union and a powerful presence in Europe. This marriage was fundamental to the formation of the Spanish Empire. While Isabella took care of internal affairs and the administration of Castile, Ferdinand focused on expansion and military campaigns. It was the strength of this alliance that allowed Isabella to make historic decisions, such as the Reconquista, and also to finance the famous voyage of Christopher Columbus, which would open the doors to the discovery of the New World. But of course, their union was not just strategic. Ferdinand and Isabella shared a deep affection for each other, and their partnership in government would make them one of the most famous couples in history. Together, they were not just monarchs, they were symbols of a new era for Spain, one of strength, determination, and greatness. When Isabella I became Queen of Castile, peace seemed to finally be within her grasp. But, as in many tales of monarchy, the struggle for power is never straightforward. Her accession to the throne was not accepted by all, and a bloody dispute would unfold, known as the War of the Castilian Succession. After the death of Henry I, many believed that the true heir to Castile would be his daughter Joanna, who became known as Joanna the Beltranella. However, Isabella's reign was already in full swing, and many did not accept that a woman should rule with such power. The struggle for succession intensified, with Isabella being challenged by those who believed that Joanna had a greater claim to the throne. The dispute would become more than a simple question of legitimacy. It was a battle for honor, for the sovereignty of Castile, and arguably, for a share of the future of Spain. Elizabeth, with her political skill, knew that she could not win the war alone. She began to consolidate her power, gaining support from the most influential noble families and the church, and quickly gained a strong base of followers. Many nobles who had previously sided with Joan switched sides, recognizing Elizabeth's strength and ability to govern. But the fight would not be easy. The war was a mix of military confrontations and diplomatic battles, with Isabella and her allies facing fierce opposition. The two factions fought for control of Castile, with Isabella seeking to establish her legitimacy, and Joanna trying to regain her father's throne. During this time, tensions between the factions grew worse, and each victory and defeat meant more than just the control of a kingdom. It was the fate of an entire dynasty. At a turning point in the war, Isabella fought a battle that would ultimately become a defining moment in her leadership. With the support of the nobility and the military, she defeated Joanna's troops, securing her position as Queen of Castile. But this victory was only the beginning of a reign that would defy the norms of the time and establish Isabella as one of the most remarkable leaders in history. However, the War of Succession had more than just political and military repercussions. It also brought to light the challenges that Elizabeth would have to face in her leadership. How could she maintain control of a divided kingdom? How could she ensure peace after so many disputes and divisions? And what could she do with the remaining opposition? With her victory in the War of Succession, Isabella had finally secured her place as the undisputed monarch of Castile. However, a great task lay ahead of her. The Kingdom of Castile, and the entire Iberian Peninsula, was still far from being truly unified. There was a monumental challenge that Isabella and Ferdinand would face together, a challenge that would define not only the future of Castile, but that of all Spain, the completion of the Reconquista. The Reconquista was a historical process that lasted centuries, initiated by the expulsion of the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula, who had invaded and occupied much of the territory during the medieval period. For centuries, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in a land of constant conflict, where the land was divided and the struggle for sovereignty seemed to never end. Isabella, with Ferdinand's support, knew that this would be one of the greatest challenges of her reign. They were the leaders of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, respectively, and their political union positioned them strategically to complete the Reconquista. But the last great Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula still held out, and that obstacle lay in Granada, a small kingdom in southern Spain. Granada, ruled by the Moors, was a prosperous city, full of culture, science, and beauty. The Alhambra, its famous palace, was a symbol of Muslim power, and the inhabitants of Granada were determined to protect their land. But Isabella and Ferdinand had a clear goal: the unification of the Iberian Peninsula under a single Christian government. To achieve this, it was necessary for Granada to fall. The war for the city was long and difficult. Over the years, Isabella and Ferdinand financed and organized a series of military campaigns. But the siege of Granada was not only a battle of strength, but also of patience, strategy, and diplomacy. King Boabdil, the last Muslim monarch of Granada, had found himself cornered and pressured on many fronts. His kingdom was in decline, and he no longer had the resources to resist. In 1492, after years of intense fighting, the armies of Isabella and Ferdinand finally managed to defeat the forces of Granada. King Boabdil was forced to surrender the city and hand over the keys of Granada to the Catholic monarchs. The event marked the end of the Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula and completed the Reconquista that had begun centuries earlier. However, the victory was not just a military triumph. It symbolized the definitive unification of Castile and Aragon and laid the foundations for the Spanish Empire. The Reconquista not only solidified the power of Isabella and Ferdinand, but also made them central figures in the European Christian world. From then on, Spain would play an increasingly important role in international affairs, both politically and religiously. The fall of Granada was a historic moment, but it was also controversial. The religious unity that the Catholic monarchs sought did not come without a cost. They decreed the expulsion of unconverted Jews and Muslims, forcing many to abandon their homes, wealth, and families. This decision, which seemed to strengthen religious unity, would have a lasting negative impact on Spanish society. Isabella and Ferdinand's victory over Granada in 1492 was a defining milestone in the history of the Iberian Peninsula, but like all great victories, it came at a price. The quest for religious unity, which the Catholic monarchs believed was essential to strengthening the kingdom, led them to make decisions that would change the history of Spain in controversial and tragic ways. One of the most controversial and painful events of this period was the expulsion of the Jews. Decreed in March 1492, under pressure from the Catholic Church, which wanted a fully Christian country, Isabella and Ferdinand ordered all Jews who did not convert to Christianity to leave the kingdom. It was a radical act that aimed not only to purify the kingdom of Castile, but also to strengthen the Catholic faith as the only religion allowed within the borders of the new Spanish Empire. The Jews of Castile were a wealthy and influential community, with many working as doctors, merchants, and bankers. Spain was deeply dependent on this community economically and culturally, but with the growth of religious fervor and pressure from the Church, the Catholic monarchs believed that true unity of the kingdom could only be achieved by imposing the Christian religion on all their subjects. This decision not only divided families and communities, but also had a devastating impact on the economy of the kingdom, as many Jews were skilled merchants and sources of wealth for Castile. The decree of expulsion, known as the Edict of Expulsion, gave Jews until the end of the year to convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. Those who chose to convert were called conversos, but distrust of them never disappeared, and many were persecuted by the Spanish Inquisition, which was designed to ensure that the conversions were genuine. For those who could not or would not convert, the only option was exile. Thousands of Jews were forced to abandon their homes, lands, and everything they had built, leaving for far-flung places such as the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and other European countries. This expulsion was not just a decision by Isabella and Ferdinand, but a human tragedy that affected thousands of families and also called into question the true nature of a monarch's power. In the name of religion and the unity of the kingdom, Isabella and Ferdinand made a decision that, although it consolidated the power of their monarchy, left a profound mark on the history of Spain. Many Jews who were forced to leave never returned, and the descendants of these families scattered throughout the world continue to bear the burden of a history of injustice and suffering. With the reign of Isabella I of Castile marked by military victories, territorial conquests, and the formation of a unified empire, her decisions were not always consensual. One of the most controversial and somber was the Spanish Inquisition, an institution created to purify the Christian faith and ensure religious homogeneity in the newly unified kingdom. Isabella and Ferdinand, though visionaries in many ways, firmly believed that the Catholic faith should be the only one permitted in their kingdom. To achieve this goal, they allied themselves with the Catholic Church, creating a force that would persecute any heresy or deviation from Christian doctrine. The Inquisition was not new to Europe, but the Spanish version was one of the most rigorous and cruel. The Inquisition was established in 1478, with the support of Isabella and Ferdinand, who believed that the persecution of heresy was essential to strengthening religious and political unity in the kingdom. Its stated purpose was to purify the Christian faith, but in practice the Inquisition became a powerful tool for controlling the behavior and beliefs of all subjects of the crown. Those accused of heresy, apostasy, or practicing non-Christian religions were subjected to intense interrogation, torture, and often execution. The Inquisition was particularly harsh on conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of practicing their former religions in secret. The distrust of the new Christians led to a series of false accusations, in which many innocent people were persecuted and even burned at the stake on charges of heresy. The persecution did not spare even the nobility. Many conversos who became influential figures in Spanish society were also targeted by the Inquisition. In addition, the Spanish Inquisition also targeted the remaining Muslim and Jewish communities. After the expulsion of the Jews, many who had converted to Christianity but continued to practice their traditions in secret were identified as Maranas. in the case of Jews, or Moriscos in the case of Muslims, and became targets of the Inquisition's investigations. The pressure to purify the faith was so strong that many, under threat of torture or death, confessed to false crimes of heresy, just to escape death or exile. The Inquisition was also not limited to those who practiced other religions. It also persecuted witches, sorcerers, and others who were seen as threats to Christian morality. This form of social and religious control had a profound impact on Spanish society, spreading fear and suspicion, making it difficult for anyone to live with freedom of belief or expression. Although the Inquisition was officially abolished in the 19th century, its effects lasted for centuries, with many descendants of those persecuted living with the stigma and consequences of their beliefs or crimes. Isabella and Ferdinand, with their religious and political views, did not realize how much this tribunal of faith would have repercussions for the future of Spain. They believed they were only strengthening the kingdom, but the Inquisition ended up creating divisions, resentment, and a legacy of intolerance. With the Inquisition, Isabella's reign was not only marked by military or political victories, but also by fear and repression. But with the end of the Inquisition and the consolidation of the Spanish Empire, something much greater was about to happen. The destiny of Spain was about to be shaped in a way that no one could have foreseen. After consolidating her power in Castile and ensuring the stability of the kingdom through the Inquisition and the Reconquista, Isabella I faced a new challenge: how to further expand Castile's influence in the world. The answer lay in a bold and unprecedented journey, a voyage into the unknown that would change the course of history forever. The man behind this journey was Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator who had been seeking support for his mission to reach Asia by sailing west across the vast and mysterious Atlantic Ocean for years. Columbus believed he could reach the Indies and that the gold and riches of the East were within his reach. But to do so, he needed a powerful sponsor who would believe in his risky vision. Columbus presented himself to several European courts, but it was in Castile that he found the answer he had been looking for. Although Columbus's project was initially rejected by many of Isabella's advisors, the Queen, with her strategic eye, saw in Columbus's plan a unique opportunity to expand Castile's horizons, and at the same time gain a crucial economic and political advantage over other European powers. Isabella, in turn, did not hesitate to finance the expedition. Her support for Columbus was a huge gamble, since, until that moment, no one knew for sure what lay beyond the vast ocean. Isabella's decision was motivated by a combination of curiosity, ambition, and a desire to bring riches to Castile. In addition, the Pope had given his blessing for Castile to become the leading Christian nation to explore new lands and convert people to Christianity, which was also part of Isabella's mission. In August 1492, after weeks of negotiations and preparation, the three caravels, Santa Maria Pinta and Niña, set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera, Spain. Columbus's journey was filled with danger, uncertainty, and many tense moments. The captain and his crew faced unknown seas, unpredictable winds, and even mutinies on board. However, Columbus's determination and Isabella's faith in him would prove fundamental. On October 12, 1492, after weeks of sailing, Columbus sighted land. He had reached what we now know as the Americas. Although he believed he had reached the Indies, the moment was historic, not only for Isabella and Castile, but for the entire world. The discovery of a new continent would open the doors to a new era of exploration and expansion. But most surprising of all, this voyage, which initially seemed like a journey to find riches, would also bring with it the encounter of two cultures that had never before met, the Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. However, this discovery was not just a victory for Castile. It also brought with it consequences that would shape future interactions between the Old World and the New World, including exploration, colonization, cultural exchange, and human tragedy. The native peoples of the Americas were quickly subjugated, and the riches brought by Columbus would change the global economy, but also result in enormous losses for the indigenous populations. Isabella, by giving her support to Columbus, not only increased the power and wealth of Castile, but also initiated one of the greatest territorial expansions in human history. The impact of this decision would reverberate for centuries, altering not only political geography, but also the dynamics between the great European powers. As Isabella watched Columbus's success, she knew that Castile would never be the same. The New World offered endless possibilities, but also immense challenges. The question was, how would Castile deal with this new empire? And what would the Catholic monarchs do with the newly conquered lands? The consequences of this discovery, as well as Isabella and Ferdinand's next steps, would be deeply marked by ambition and doubt, glory and tragedy. As Spain was about to embark on a new era of exploration and expansion with the discovery of the Americas, Isabella I of Castile was not only concerned with her overseas empire. She knew that in order to maintain power and stability within her borders, it would also be necessary to reform and strengthen the kingdom's internal institutions, especially the justice system. The legal system was one of the fundamental pillars of a kingdom that sought unity, prosperity, and control. Isabella understood that a kingdom governed by law and order was essential to Castile's prosperity. Her vision was clear: a system of justice that was fair, efficient, and that benefited everyone, from the humblest peasant to the noble. With this in mind, she initiated a series of reforms that would make Castile one of the most centralized monarchies in medieval Europe. One of the first changes was the centralization of judicial power. Elizabeth wanted to ensure that laws were applied consistently and without interference from local nobility, who often used their power to obtain favors and exemptions. The nobility, who often had their own courts and privileges, had to defer to the central authority of the crown, which helped ensure that laws were followed more uniformly throughout the kingdom. The creation of royal courts was also one of Elizabeth's innovations. She wanted to ensure that legal decisions were made impartially and fairly, without the weight of wealth or power interfering in the judgment. To this end, she appointed royal judges, known as oyeders, to oversee judicial proceedings throughout the kingdom, ensuring that sentences were carried out without the influence of local factions. The figure of the oyeders was important in ensuring that judicial decisions were aligned with the crown and the values of the monarchy. In addition, Elizabeth sought to promote reforms in civil and criminal law. The kingdom's laws became clearer and stricter, with severe punishments for crimes such as treason, theft, and murder. But at the same time, the Queen also sought to ensure that judicial processes were conducted in a more humane manner, seeking to avoid excessive cruelty and punishments. She also strove to ensure that the rights of defendants were respected, even in difficult times. Isabella's crown also established a more efficient system of tax collection and resource distribution, based on a legal system that allowed the central government to have full control over the kingdom's finances and administration. This helped to strengthen the Spanish economy, allowing the crown to invest in new expeditions, the army, and the construction of a more robust infrastructure to support the empire's growth. However, Elizabeth's reforms were not without controversy. The changes she implemented, especially the strengthening of the authority of the crown, reduced the power of many noble families, who found their prerogatives limited. This generated internal resistance and tensions, especially in regions where the nobility had more influence. Nevertheless, Elizabeth continued to implement her reforms with determination, believing that the stability and unity of the kingdom were more important than the personal interests of the nobility. Furthermore, Isabella's legal reforms helped lay a solid foundation for the Spanish Empire, which would later expand into the Americas. Without a centralized and efficient legal system, managing a global empire would be nearly impossible. And it was through these reforms that Isabella prepared Castile to become one of the most powerful powers in Europe, with a solid government structure capable of dealing with the challenges of a growing monarchy. After a series of internal and external victories, Isabella I of Castile was about to take the decisive steps that would transform Castile into one of the greatest powers in the world. Her reign was marked by the consolidation of centralized power and the strengthening of an absolute monarchy, where the Queen not only controlled justice and religion, but also laid the foundations for the creation of a modern Spanish state. Before Isabella's reign, Spain was a fragmented territory where several kingdoms and nobles enjoyed considerable autonomy. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Leon were distinct kingdoms with their own laws, rulers, and administrations. The crown's control over these lands was relatively weak, which created an unequal and often disorganized political system. Isabella knew that for her dynasty to last and for Castile to be able to expand its borders, it would be necessary to create a centralized, strong, and cohesive system of government. The Queen, together with her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, set about unifying the kingdom under a single rule, putting aside regional rivalries and establishing a more centralized power in the hands of the crown. Although Isabella's marriage to Ferdinand created a union between Castile and Aragon, the two kingdoms continued to exist separately, each with its own laws and administrators. However, over time, Isabella gradually eliminated the barriers that separated these two entities and promoted a centralized system that allowed for more efficient control over all territories. One of the most significant ways in which Isabella consolidated this power was through administrative reform. She created a network of governors, called veres, to oversee the different territories, especially the most remote and uncontrolled regions of the empire. At the same time, she established a system of royal councils that helped administer the kingdom's policies. These councils were composed of men loyal to the crown and had the authority to resolve political, economic, and military issues, always with the aim of ensuring the strengthening of central power. In addition, Isabella also reformed the Spanish army and navy. She knew that in order to ensure the security of the kingdom and expand its borders, Spain needed a modern and well-trained army. Under her leadership, Spain became a military powerhouse, capable of taking on other major European powers and exploring new territories overseas. It was during this period that Spanish armies became known for their discipline and strength, setting the model for military strength that would spread throughout the Americas and beyond. Religious unification was another key aspect in the creation of the modern Spanish state. Isabella believed that for the kingdom to be truly united, all of her subjects needed to share the same faith. She sought not only to consolidate the power of the Catholic Church, but also to ensure that the practice of Christianity was homogeneous throughout the kingdom. This culminated in the expulsion of the Jews and the implementation of the Inquisition, measures that aimed to eliminate religious diversity in the kingdom and consolidate Spain's Catholic identity. In addition to all these internal reforms, Isabella also knew that the creation of a strong and modern state was not limited to the borders of Castile. She began to project Spain as a global power, ready to compete for control of overseas lands with other European empires. The sponsorship of Christopher Columbus, which led to the discovery of the Americas, was the first major move of the new Spanish state. The exploration of the New World would not only bring immeasurable riches to the kingdom, but would also allow Spain to expand its power and influence beyond the borders of Europe. But as the Spanish Empire expanded, Isabella's centralized administration was far from unchallenged. Many noble families opposed the growing power of the crown and the loss of their own autonomy. The balance between the power of the monarchy and the rights of the nobles was one of the most delicate issues of Isabella's reign. Despite this, the queen did not give in to pressure and pursued her vision of a strong and united kingdom. By the end of her reign, Isabella I had laid the foundations for what would become the Spanish Empire, a world power that would dominate vast parts of Europe, America, and Asia for centuries. The modern Spanish state she helped build would not only change the history of Spain, but would also leave an indelible mark on world history, with profound consequences for international relations, the global economy, and the cultures of the Americas. The Catholic faith was one of the central pillars of the reign of Isabella I of Castile. For her and Ferdinand, religious unity was fundamental not only for internal stability, but also for strengthening political power and legitimizing their rule. Religion was not just a matter of personal belief. It was a crucial element in the construction of the modern Spanish state and in justifying the most controversial decisions of the reign. Isabella I and Ferdinand of Aragon were widely known as the Catholic monarchs, a title that not only reflected their religious devotion, but also their mission to defend and expand the Catholic faith. Under their reign, the Catholic Church became a powerful force, with the monarchy playing an active role in overseeing religious matters and creating a society that was homogeneous in terms of faith. The connection between royal power and the church was profound, with the crown investing heavily in maintaining and reinforcing Catholicism as the official religion of the kingdom. Religious unity was a clear and persistent goal of Isabella. After the capture of Granada and the expulsion of the Jews, she focused her efforts on ensuring that Castile would be a purely Catholic Christian kingdom. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, was one of the most powerful instruments in achieving this religious unity. Under the pretext of combating heresy and ensuring that those who claimed to be Christians really were, the Inquisition hunted down, tortured and executed thousands of people who were seen as threats to the Christian faith. The policy of expulsion and conversion had a lasting impact on the kingdom, with Jews and Muslims forced to either convert to Christianity or leave Spain. The conversos, Jews and Muslims who converted to Catholicism, were closely monitored by the Church and often persecuted by the Inquisition, accused of practicing their original faith in secret. This created an environment of widespread distrust, where any deviation from orthodox behavior could result in serious accusations and severe punishment. But for Isabella, religious unity was not limited to her subjects within Castile. She wanted to ensure that all newly conquered territories, such as Granada, would become exclusively Catholic, reflecting her ambition to be seen as a defender of the Christian faith in the world. This religious fervor was also reflected in her political decisions and international alliances, with Spain seeking to align itself with other Catholic nations and combat those it considered enemies of the Church. However, this union of faith and political power also came at a price. The close connection between church and state meant that the Church was not only a source of legitimacy for the monarchy, but also a powerful institution that directly influenced political and military decisions. This power of the Church, combined with the centralized control of the crown, meant that Elizabeth's monarchy had a great ability to shape society and ensure that everyone followed the same religious and moral vision. The rise of Catholicism was not only a matter of religious dominance, but also a way of ensuring social and political cohesion. By promoting a single faith, Elizabeth sought to avoid internal divisions that could undermine the stability of the kingdom. Religion became a crucial tool in the formation of a strong and united empire, but also a means of legitimizing brutal and discriminatory actions against those who opposed the regime. As Isabella consolidated Castile's power with the support of the Church, she also knew that future generations of the empire would have to deal with the repercussions of these policies. The expulsion of the Jews and the persecution of the conversos generated deep resentments that would echo for centuries, not only in Castile, but also in the regions of the New World, where Spanish expansion would encounter completely different cultures and religions. However, faith was also a source of strength for Isabel. She sincerely believed that her mission was divine, that God had chosen her to lead Castile and restore the true Christian faith. Her religious devotion sustained her in the most difficult political and military battles, and she never hesitated to make the Church a fundamental pillar in her construction of power. The death of Isabella I of Castile in 1504 marked the end of an era for Spain, and at the same time, the beginning of a crisis that would shake the foundations of the Spanish Empire. The Queen, who had ruled with such power and determination, left a legacy that transformed Castile. But it also left a complex question pending: who would take her place? Isabella had no sons who could inherit the throne directly, which placed her daughter Joanna of Castile, also known as Joanna the Mad, in the line of succession. Joanna was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, and had been raised to be the future Queen of Castile, but her mental health had always been a cause for concern. From a young age, Joanna showed signs of emotional instability, which caused great apprehension in those in power. Isabella's death threw Castile into a succession crisis, as the rightful heir Joanna was not seen as capable of ruling. Joanna's husband, Philip of Habsburg, known as Philip the Fair, did not have the same concerns about his wife's mental health. In fact, he was ambitious and wanted to take the throne of Castile for himself, which created an internal dispute that would divide the Spanish nobility and complicate relations between Castile and the other kingdoms of Europe. After Isabella's death, the struggle for succession became fierce. Many nobles, who had opposed Joanna's reign, decided to support Philip of Habsburg, placing him as King of Castile. This division resulted in a serious dispute between factions at court, with one part of the kingdom recognizing Joanna's authority and the other that of Philip. The situation was further complicated by Joanna's personality, who in her mental fragility was manipulated by her husband Philip and by others who saw her as a monarch, incapable of governing. Isabella had already taken steps to ensure that Castile remained unified during her lifetime, but the circumstances surrounding her death meant that these measures were not enough to prevent the fragmentation of the kingdom. While Philip took the reins of power in Castile, Joanna was confined to a state of seclusion, considered unfit to govern. This succession crisis not only threatened the political stability of Castile, but also jeopardized the union between Castile and Aragon, since Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella's husband, was also fighting for control of Castile. Philip's power, however, was not easy to maintain. As he attempted to consolidate his rule over Castile, tensions with the local nobility grew. Many feared that Philip was merely an interloper, seeking power for the House of Habsburg, rather than for the good of Castile. The Castilian nobles, fearful of Philip's growing influence, began to rebel, seeking to maintain control of their land in the hands of a legitimate king. The crisis thus became a struggle, not only for the succession, but also for the identity and independence of Castile. The solution to this crisis would come from Ferdinand of Aragon, who after Isabella's death, was named regent of Castile. Although Ferdinand was no longer at his peak due to his advanced age, he was an experienced leader and had the support of various sectors of the nobility. He dedicated himself to restoring order and maintaining stability. But the dilemma of succession still hung over Castile. The dispute over the crown would continue for years, with different factions seeking control, and political instability would last until Philip of Habsburg was finally recognized as king, despite constant tensions between the different groups. This succession crisis, marked by family rivalries, political intrigues, and disputes over the crown, had a profound impact on Spain. It not only weakened the monarchy and the unity of the kingdom, but also weakened the power base that Isabella and Ferdinand had worked so hard to build. The future of Spain, therefore, depended not only on the resolution of this crisis, but also on the ability of subsequent monarchs to maintain the cohesion of the empire and ensure that Spain continued its rise as a world power. Isabella I of Castile, though remembered primarily for her political and military achievements, also left an indelible mark on the cultural and educational landscape of Spain. Her reign was not only a time of war and territorial expansion, but also of cultural and intellectual flowering, a renaissance that would help prepare Spain for the role of world power that it would play in the decades to come. The Queen had a clear vision that education was essential to building a strong and lasting empire. She not only promoted education in Castile, but also helped establish a model of education that aimed to produce loyal, wise, and competent citizens for the government of the vast Spanish Empire. One of the great innovations of her reign was the encouragement of the formation of universities and higher education institutions, as well as the support for the development of cultural institutions that would enrich Spain's intellectual heritage. Isabella was a strong advocate of education for women, something relatively rare for her time. She believed that education was a fundamental right for all, regardless of gender, and her commitment to educating women was evident in many of her political and personal decisions. Her daughter, Joanna of Castile, received a high-quality education based on the standards of the Castilian court. Isabella wanted to ensure that, even in a time when women rarely wielded power, future generations of women in the Castilian court would have the ability to influence and understand the world around them. Isabella also encouraged the arts and sciences. Spain, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, began to excel in a number of cultural areas, including literature, music, and painting. The Queen's support of artists and intellectuals made the Castilian court a center of cultural development. Many of the most brilliant artists and scientists of the time were patronized by Isabella and Ferdinand, and this helped lay the foundation for a rich artistic tradition that would flourish in the following centuries, during the height of the Spanish Empire. One example of this was the support of the Renaissance in Castile, where the Queen encouraged the study of classical sciences such as philosophy, literature, and astronomy. Isabella was a great patron of Cristobal Colón, not only because of his exploration of the New World, but also because he shared with her an interest in the advancement of knowledge. The Queen also supported other Renaissance figures who were beginning to emerge in Europe, believing that science and art should be used for the good of her empire. Isabella also helped to establish several royal libraries and book collections that contributed to the dissemination of new knowledge. During her reign, Castile became a center of study and cultural exchange. The Spanish Empire was beginning to become a link between the Islamic, European, and later American worlds, and education would play a crucial role in integrating these disparate worlds. Yet, for all her cultural contributions, Isabella's educational legacy was also shaped by contradictions. The Inquisition and the persecution of religious diversity limited intellectual development and freedom of thought in some areas. The repression of Jews, Muslims, and other monarchs, who had contributed greatly to medieval culture and science, made Isabella's reign a period of great achievements, but also of great losses for the intellectual potential of the Spanish Empire. Even so, Isabella's impact on education and culture cannot be underestimated. Her support for educational institutions and the arts helped prepare Spain to become one of Europe's cultural powerhouses, creating a foundation that would sustain the empire for centuries. As Spain expanded its borders, Isabella's desire to invest in education would help ensure that future generations of rulers, nobles, and intellectuals would be well prepared to deal with the empire's new challenges. Isabella's cultural and educational legacy would not only shape Spain, but would also have a profound impact on the lands she conquered, where European education and culture would be introduced and adapted to the new world. Isabella I of Castile was one of the most extraordinary figures in medieval and Renaissance history. In a world dominated by men, she not only challenged the social and political norms of her time, but also paved the way for future generations of women who, like her, would seek power, influence, and respect in spheres where they had previously been marginalized. As queen, Isabella was a trailblazer, showing that women could rule with the same skill, wisdom, and courage as men. When Isabella ascended to the throne of Castile, the idea of a female ruler was almost unimaginable. Medieval society was predominantly patriarchal, and women rarely had access to positions of power, especially in kingdoms as fragmented as Castile. At the time, women were often seen more as political pawns in marital alliances than as leaders capable of governing independently, and yet Isabella overcame all of these barriers. Unlike other monarchs of her time, Isabella did not depend on the power of a husband or father to rule. She took the throne herself, and not only ruled, but also shaped the politics of Castile, consolidating her power, imposing reforms and making decisions that transformed her kingdom. Her union with Ferdinand of Aragon, although important politically, did not diminish her authority. In fact, the marriage was a strategic partnership, in which both had complementary roles, but Isabella always remained the dominant figure in Castile. Furthermore, Elizabeth surrounded herself with loyal and wise advisors, regardless of their gender. She was a practical ruler who knew when to give in and when to stand her ground, always with the goal of preserving the stability and prosperity of the kingdom. This did not mean that she was immune to criticism or scorn, but rather that she knew how to use politics, diplomacy, and force to achieve her goals. One of the biggest issues during her reign was the role of women in government. Elizabeth managed not only to establish herself as a monarch, but also to lead a nation that lived in many ways under the precepts of a medieval society that limited opportunities for women. Her reign demonstrated that a woman could be sovereign, exercise absolute power, and make history at the same time. However, Elizabeth's reign was not without its challenges. Although she was respected by many, there were also those who questioned the authority of a woman on the throne. The war over the succession with her niece, Joanna the Beltranea, is an example of how women in positions of power were often discredited. The legitimacy of Elizabeth's reign was often questioned simply on the basis of her gender. Even when her authority was accepted, perception that a woman should not reign was a constant. Elizabeth also faced internal criticism about her role in government, with some suggesting that she should be more submissive to the church or to male figures in her court. However, Elizabeth defied these expectations with her political skill and leadership, showing that female power did not have to be less effective or respectable than male power. The impact of Isabella's reign on Spanish politics was profound, as her rule paved the way for women who would later become powerful figures in European politics. Although her reign was an isolated case of female success in an era dominated by men, Isabella's role opened doors for women in neighboring kingdoms and future monarchs, such as Maria Theresa of Austria or Catherine the Great of Russia, who also broke barriers and became rulers of vast empires. Furthermore, Isabella's reign had a profound impact on the women of the Spanish court and the upper classes of society. The queen was not only a political leader, but also a model of virtue, strength, and female leadership. She represented the possibility that a woman did not need to be limited by social expectations and could achieve great things in the fields of politics, art, and education. Elizabeth not only ruled wisely, but she also maintained a strong government capable of defending her nation and expanding its borders, both in the Old World and in the Americas. Her reign marked an era in which women began to be seen not just as political objects or decorative figures, but as real forces of change, sovereigns capable of ruling with authority. Although Isabella I of Castile is most often remembered for her diplomacy and political acumen, a crucial aspect of her reign was her impressive military acumen. Isabella was not just a refined court queen, she was a shrewd strategist and military leader who knew how to use her strengths to consolidate Castile's power and secure the future of her empire. Her rule was marked by a combination of decisive action and a unique ability to mobilize resources to protect the kingdom and expand its borders. One of the earliest proofs of Isabella's military vision was the Reconquista, the struggle to expel the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. The capture of Granada in 1492 was a decisive victory, not only for Castile, but for all of Spain. Isabella and Ferdinand were not only political monarchs, they were skilled generals who knew how to coordinate complex military campaigns. Isabella supported her husband Ferdinand in organizing armies and financing campaigns, but she was also personally involved in overseeing strategy and monitoring victories and defeats. Her understanding of military needs and her ability to unite the noble factions and leaders of her court were crucial to the success of the Reconquista. Isabella also knew that to ensure the stability of the kingdom after the victory in Granada, it would be necessary to secure the loyalty of the armed forces and maintain control over the newly conquered regions. The integration of the forces of Castile and Aragon under a single leadership was a milestone in her ability to command the army. She not only consolidated power within Castile, but also brought Aragonese troops into the campaigns, creating a stronger and more cohesive Spanish army. However, Isabella's military vision was not limited to the home front. With the unification of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the Queen and Ferdinand now found themselves at the head of an empire with a unique geostrategic position. Isabella realized that the key to the growth of the Spanish Empire lay beyond the Iberian Peninsula. To expand Castile's influence, she needed to protect trade routes and ensure that the monarchy had access to new territories. With this in mind, sponsoring Christopher Columbus's voyage fit perfectly with her strategic vision. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 was undoubtedly one of the most important milestones in Isabella's military history. Although Columbus's project was initially viewed with skepticism by many of her court advisors, the Queen was able to see the value of the expedition. For Isabella, the conquest of the New World not only represented a source of wealth and new lands, but also a way to establish Castile's military and political superiority over other European powers. By allowing Spanish navigators to reach the Americas, Isabella and Ferdinand were in effect paving the way for the future domination of a global empire. Furthermore, Isabella was a monarch who deeply understood the importance of maintaining a well-trained and disciplined army. During her reign, the Spanish monarchy invested heavily in the education and training of its troops. The Queen knew that in order to sustain the expansion of the empire, it would be necessary to ensure Spain's military supremacy not only in Europe but also in its future colonies. She encouraged the use of new military technologies and the implementation of more advanced warfare techniques, which helped create an army capable of fighting on fronts as far away as the Americas. Isabella also implemented a system of defense of Spanish territory that extended not only to the peninsular kingdoms, but also to the colonies. Control of trade routes and the defense of the newly discovered lands in America required that Castile maintain a significant military presence in distant territories. With this in mind, Isabella began the construction of a network of fortresses and military bases that would ensure the protection of the empire for centuries. The defensive fortresses in the Americas, such as in Santo Domingo, were a reflection of this strategy, ensuring that Castile maintained control over the newly conquered lands. But, like all great leaders, Elizabeth's military vision also had its costs. The constant need for resources for military campaigns and the maintenance of a strong army resulted in heavy taxes on the population, which generated internal tensions. The nobility also began to question the weight of military expenditure in times of expansion. Despite this, Elizabeth maintained her firm position, prioritizing the security of the empire and the strengthening of the power of the crown. The Queen, with her strategic skill, knew how to balance the need for a powerful military force with the demands of day-to-day governance. She was a leader who did not simply see battles as something to be won with troops, but as a game of alliances, strategy and resources. Her empire would not be conquered by brute force alone, but by a clever combination of diplomacy, economics, and of course military power. The Spanish Inquisition, created in 1478 by Isabella and Ferdinand, was one of the most controversial institutions in the history of the Spanish monarchy. Although it was established with the intention of maintaining religious unity and ensuring that all subjects of the kingdom followed the Catholic faith, the Inquisition quickly became a symbol of repression, intolerance, and violence. Its legacy is full of shadows, and its consequences lasted for centuries, both in Castile and in the regions of the New World. When Isabella and Ferdinand founded the Inquisition, the aim was to purify the kingdom of Muslim and Jewish influences. Following the victory of the Reconquista and the religious unification of Spain, conversos Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity were the main targets of the Inquisition, with the Catholic Church trying to ensure that their conversions were genuine and not just formal. Marranos converted Jews and Moriscos converted Muslims were often accused of continuing to practice their old religions in secret, something that many, including members of the nobility, saw as a threat to the religious and political unity of the kingdom. The Inquisition was cruel in its execution. Those accused of heresy, blasphemy, or secret religious practices were taken to ecclesiastical tribunals where they faced brutal interrogations, physical torture, and often death. The auto da fe, public acts of condemnation, became a public spectacle where those found guilty were burned at the stake, while the population watched this extreme punishment. Many innocent people were forced to confess to crimes they did not commit, due to pressure and torture, which created a cycle of injustice and suffering. In addition to the conversos and Moriscos, the Inquisition also persecuted other groups considered heretics, including witches, sorcerers, and even scientists whose discoveries were seen as contrary to the religious doctrine of the time. The persecution of science and knowledge, often associated with the Inquisition, had a negative impact on the intellectual development of Spain and retarded progress in several areas. By supporting the Inquisition, Isabella and Ferdinand believed they were protecting the unity of the kingdom and consolidating the strength of the Catholic Church. However, the consequences of this policy were much more complex. The Inquisition not only caused suffering to thousands of people, but also left a legacy of fear and distrust. The religious diversity that had once characterized Spain was replaced by a rigid Catholic uniformity, and the repression of freedom of belief created an atmosphere of hostility and intolerance that would have devastating consequences for future generations. In the years following Isabella's death, criticism of the Inquisition began to grow, both within Spain and abroad. Many, including members of the Church itself, began to question the morality of the Inquisition's practices and the effectiveness of its actions. The expulsion of the Jews and the persecution of Muslims made Spain a less tolerant place, which had a negative impact on its economy, as the Jewish and Muslim populations, once extremely influential in commerce, finance, and the arts, were forced to leave the country. The effects of this were felt for centuries as the more tolerant European nations advanced in science and commerce. Although the Inquisition was officially abolished in the 19th century, its echoes can still be heard in debates about religious freedom, human rights, and the role of the Church in politics. The memory of the Inquisition has become a point of reflection on the limits of state power and religious authority, and the fight against dogmatism and religious intolerance remains one of the central issues in many societies to this day. The legacy of the Inquisition also had an impact on the relationship between Spain and other European powers. At the time, many nations began to distance themselves from Spain, which came to be seen as a closed and repressive state. The centralization of power in the Church, although it strengthened the monarchy of Isabella and Ferdinand, also imposed limits on the intellectual and cultural development of the kingdom, while other European powers such as the Netherlands, England, and France were modernizing. Yet it is impossible to deny that the Inquisition, along with Isabella's military and diplomatic victories, helped shape the course of the Spanish Empire. Although it caused immense suffering and was responsible for a dark part of Isabella's legacy, the Inquisition was also seen by its supporters as a necessary measure to strengthen the kingdom's religious unity and internal security. History, as always, is complex, and the impact of the Inquisition remains a matter of debate. How then can we assess the legacy of Elizabeth I? Although she was an extraordinary monarch, her association with the Inquisition raises questions about the limits of power and authority that are still debated in modern contexts. After all, how can religious control be balanced with human rights and individual freedom? Elizabeth's story, marked by both achievement and controversy, serves as a reminder that power must be exercised responsibly and compassionately. Did you like this story? Leave your like, comment, and share with your friends. Until the next story.